students, the class is now in session. Today I want to share with you the key lessons I've learned from my language teachers, the good and the bad. Let's dive in. I want to start with the teacher who taught me English. And to give you an idea of her personality and approach, she reminded me a lot of Professor McGonagall from Harry Potter. Strict, serious, meticulous, and a perfectionist through and through. When I was in the 9th grade, I was preparing for the national English competition here in Ukraine, and my English teacher was forcing me to write practice essays on a variety of topics, ranging from women's rights to over-consumerism. And not only did she correct my grammatical and orthographic mistakes, she shredded my essays to absolute pieces to make sure that my arguments were convincing and logical, that I used the most appropriate words to express my thoughts, and that the final product was strong and elegant not only in its writing, but also in its thinking. Thanks to the ruthlessness and diligence of my teacher, I learned about things like inversion, the rhythm of sentences, the use of advanced or, on the contrary, less sophisticated words, and, above all else, how to form and express my opinion in a foreign language in the most accurate and authentic way. These writing skills helped me tremendously when I was preparing for TOEFL and even writing practice essays in other languages. What's more, they've also proven invaluable for my university essays, even though academic writing is a different format. But still, the core principles remained applicable. Therefore, lesson number 1, work on your writing skills in a foreign language. By the way, let me know if you'd be interested in a separate video on how to improve your writing skills in English or any other foreign language for that matter, because I have a lot to say on this topic. Moving on to a less fortunate teaching experience, we have my university Spanish professor, who bore an uncanny resemblance to Professor Snape. Old-fashioned, even blinkered, completely devoid of sense of humor and just as harsh on his students. For starters, he was using an old black and white textbook which was printed years before Spain joined the European Union, when they still had pesetas as a currency. And I'm not saying that all textbooks are bad, but this one really was. One of the first chapters of the book listed various professions like a carpenter, a welder, a plumber, a pipe fitter, and a bunch of others that I've never even heard of in my mother tongue. Some of these professions have even stunned my friend from the Dominican Republic, a native Spanish speaker, by the way. Hi Ray, if you're watching. Yet, these were the professions that our professor quizzed us about on our midterm exam. This ties to one very important yet somehow overlooked principle when it comes to approaching textbooks, which is taking what's useful for you and leaving the rest. Because you see, as a beginner, your mental space is limited because you're being subjected to all these weird sounds, grammar structures, new words, and your mind takes it much longer to process them as compared to the languages that you're more familiar with. That's why it's completely okay to skip specialized or impractical vocabulary that doesn't serve you and focus on relevant words that are applicable to your life. And if you'd like to hear more on this topic, I've spoken about this in my video on how to choose the right language textbook for you. So, while my Spanish professor Snape insists on irrelevant vocabulary, I say focus on actionable words that will help you speak sooner. Another grave mishap of this professor was that he taught us el subjuntivo, the subjunctive, which we were studying in scrupulous detail the entire second semester as A1 beginners. Mind you, we didn't study any new words or useful grammar like the most simple past tense, yet we spent an excruciating amount of time on a grammar structure that learners usually start to dip their toes in at a B1 level. Now, you've heard me say multiple times on this channel that grammar is paramount for beginners. And it will help you start speaking sooner, but only if it's proportionate with your current level. If grammar is too difficult, all it will do is overwhelm you and you won't be able to use it. So, to my Spanish professor, I say, ridiculous. Next. This one is tricky because when I was studying Turkish, I had multiple professors. But if I had to create a composite image, then it would have to be Hagrid, the Hogwarts professor who helped to not only understand the magical creatures, but also love them. And for lack of a better word, Turkish was a magical creature for me. As someone who grew up speaking and studying primarily European languages, getting used to the way Turkish worked was quite an experience. It was a beast of a language, but thanks to a group of passionate teachers, I began to not only understand it, but also really enjoy it. When it came to grammar, they kept it relevant to our level and well-structured, which helped me see progress clearly and stay on track. At a certain point, the teachers introduced exercises where we would rewrite long Turkish sentences using specific grammar structures. And if you are even a tiny bit familiar with this language, you'll know how ornate the sentences can get. These exercises helped me become more comfortable with Turkish and almost feel like a wizard, because I could play around with the language and knew multiple ways to express myself. In addition to that, as we progressed and were learning more and more new words, my teachers would write multiple synonyms together on the blackboard, sometimes 3 or even 4 of them at once, every time we encountered a new word that we had already had simpler alternatives for. Which meant that when it came to speaking and writing essays, we had an abundance of synonyms to rely on. The peculiarity of Turkish is that it has a lot of words of Persian, Arabic, and French origins, along with their Turkish counterparts, and grouping them together helped me to not only memorize various alternatives, but also keep up when somebody was using a more advanced or formal vocabulary. So, with a structured approach and an effort to constantly enrich your vocabulary, you can tame any magical beast of a language. And last but not least, I can't help mentioning my French professor, a person who almost made me hate this language. Those who've been subscribed to this channel for quite a while have already heard this story, but in short, I began studying French when I came to Rennes, Brittany, on my 1-year Erasmus University exchange. And having an opportunity to spend the entire academic year in a French-speaking environment, I was determined to become fluent. So much so that I was taking both beginner and intermediate French courses during my first semester. However, despite having 8 hours of French class every week and doing every home assignment, I still couldn't speak. The problem was that our professor was using a multitude of scattered texts and audio recordings in an attempt to make us acquire the language like babies. Plot twist, that didn't work. Just like all other proponents of pure comprehensible input, he was nothing but an imposter. Does he remind you of someone? When I came back home for my winter holidays, I was struck by the painful realization of having already spent half of my academic year in France, yet, despite all the time I've spent attending classes and doing homework, being unable to form the most basic sentences correctly. That's when I decided to take the matter into my own hands and got myself a grammar book, which became the thing that moved the needle for me. And without exaggeration, I learned more in 3 weeks than in the entire semester. What's more, when I came back to Rennes, the professor instantly remarked on my progress and said that it must be thanks to his classes. Now, I was angry, but I decided not to dim his spirits after all. Sometimes a language teacher is a person who truly guides us through the language, but sometimes they can also bring us to impassable woods and leave us there. That's why I find it appropriate to call out those who lack professionalism and end up wasting our time. If I had a time turner, I would go back in time and get myself a grammar book or a good textbook on my arrival to France. But in the absence of one, I can only advise people in a similar situation to take a proactive approach and find a way to structure their language learning in a way that helps them see progress clearly, instead of stagnating and wasting their time, energy, and enthusiasm. As you can imagine, this is still a very sore point for me. Avada! No, this would be too much. I'd probably end up in Slytherin.
Not Slytherin. Not Slytherin.
To sum up, while I was extremely lucky with some of my language teachers, I had a fair share of bad ones too. That said, a bad experience can be useful if you manage to draw conclusions from it in time. If you enjoyed this video, please support it with comments. I've noticed a drop in my views recently, so maybe we can put a collective magic spell on it. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye!